Howls Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones is my favorite book of all time. I first read it whenever I was like in 7th or 8th grade, and I absolutely fell in love, and I read it every single year. So, whenever I had the opportunity to write about this novel in an essay for graduate school, I was like, okay, yeah, let's look at this book academically, which is actually something that's not done too terribly often. I mean, more and more scholars are talking about children's literature, but a lot of scholarship is still dedicated to like classic literature, like, Victorian and Faulkner and all those other people. So, whenever I was reading and researching for my essay on Howls Moving Castle, I noticed that Diana Wynne Jones uses stereotypes, specifically the ones that we find in fairy tales. But she doesn't use them in the way that we really expect. Like, she doesn't use them how we see in fairy tales, obviously, but in Disney movies and all these other stories that we consume on a daily basis. Instead, she takes these stereotypes and she subverts them. She deconstructs them, giving them multiple meanings. And this deconstruction allows her characters to rewrite their past, their lives, their characters, and allows them to determine their own fate. And we see this specifically with Sophie. And that leads us to this essay. Diana Wynne Jones is the queen of misdirection, at least in my opinion. When I first read Howls Moving Castle around a decade ago, I thought that the novel would be about Howl and he would be the hero because of the title. However, for much of the novel, he throws fits of green slime and sneezes loud enough to shake the castle, just for attention. Even though Howl is the charismatic character, Sophie is the real hero, and her entire world has to be uprooted so that she can achieve heroic capabilities. She believes that she is destined for failure, but once she is transformed into an old woman by the Witch of the Waste, the evil witch, Sophie realizes that she has the ability to change the fairy tale tropes that control her through the art of storytelling. Relying on fairy tale structure, something very familiar to most people, Joan leads her readers, such as myself, to believe that this novel will follow narrative conventions. Of course, I should have realized that that assumption was faulty since there is a moving castle. However, Jones questions fairy tale tropes, not simply flipping expectations in the land of Ingery, but using a more variegated and unstable heterodoxy. This heterodoxy opens the possibilities to subvert fairy tale tropes and allows Jones to insert instability into the novel, giving Sophie the ability to control the story. However, Sophie is not an authoritative storyteller, open to seeing the complexities of the characters derived from fairy tale tropes, so they have the freedom to write their own stories. Spinning stereotypes. Famously, the brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm, collected fairy tales, preserving classic stories such as Cinderella, Rumpelstiltskin, and Snow White. They wanted to preserve oral tradition, documenting German mentalities over the centuries in their anthropological research. Instead, they wrote stories that have influenced people into our modern times, especially with the adaptation of many fairy tales into animated films. For their research, the brothers Grimm turned to people who told stories the most often, German women. Discussing the origins of fairy tales, Ruth B. Bottenheimer writes, German folktales were assumed to have originated in or to have passed through, in many cases, the spinning room, for it was there that women gathered in the evening and told tales to keep themselves and their company awake as they spun. Spinning was not just an obligatory household chore. It was a marker of a diligent woman in a patriarchal society. Bottenheimer explains, the spindle is, as the tales themselves demonstrate, not only the identifying mark of a wise woman, but of all women, and especially, in the Germanys from the Middle Ages to the 19th century, of diligent, well-ordered womanhood. As a result, many of the fairy tales documented by the Brothers Grimm are about spinning thread, called spinning tales, defined as those in which either the act or implements of spinning form part of the tale. while the Brothers Grimm's translations of spinning tales portray spinning in a positive light. Scholars, such as Bottenheimer, believe that these women felt trapped by spinning and told stories that were an imagined reprieve from the chore. For many scholars of fairy tales, the main voice of the men who collected the stories hide in the plaintive cries of the original tellers. Two voices seem to be present, one expressing dissatisfaction towards his archetypically female employment, with another voice appearing to affirm and extol spinning as a worthwhile enterprise. German women stayed up late into the night spinning after a long day of housework. We can imagine that spinning thread is the last thing they wanted to do. As a result, many spinning tales declare that flax spinning is evil, awful, and the best one can do is be quit of it. While describing spinning tales, Bottenheimer further states, where spinning itself is of the subject of the tale, the female protagonist is unequivocal in her detestation of spinning, resorting to trickery, deceit, or supernatural powers to avoid it. The patriarchal voice covers his cry for help, altering the language of the tales from the source. Vocabulary carries its own normative freight, and young readers of these tales could make no mistake about the nature of the girl who took up the work appropriate to her and did well. She was clever, skillful, diligent, beautiful, loyal, nimble, industrious, and jolly. Bottenheimer's observation shows that stories told in the spin's tube sought freedom from spinning, but a patriarchal voice belonging to the Brothers Grimm takes the freedom away from the characters and, to an extension, German women. The patriarchal voice views all women using the same requirements based on spinning without any variation, creating an oversimplification of women's character, leading to stereotypes based on this perspective. The patriarchal, often dictatorial voice in fairy tales affects more than just the characters. While children listen intently to fairy tales to find out what happens to the characters, they also learn behavioral and associated patterns, value systems, and how to predict the consequences of specific acts or circumstances. They also learn behavioral and associated patterns, value systems, and how to predict the consequences of specific acts or circumstances. These tales present a picture of sexual roles, behavior, and psychology, and a way of predicting outcome or fate according to sex. For example, while reading Cinderella, children may learn that only obedient, passive girls live happily ever after. So girls may want to be obedient and passive so that they can live happily ever after. Passive girls are portrayed as good girls, and these girls get happy endings repeatedly in fairy tale canon. These stories do not present any variations on how to be a good girl, creating a powerful stereotype. These stereotypes permeate in our society and dictate how many people see others' capabilities, mostly by gender. Probably unknowingly, the Brothers Grimm spun stereotypes that still affect people today. However, using deconstruction, a post-structuralist movement, readers can give stereotypes new meanings, freeing us from the confines of stereotypes, just as German women escaped the confines of spinning. Fighting for freedom. Deconstruction, introduced by Jacque Derrida, is a response to structuralism and its introduction of signifiers, words, and signifies, meanings. Derrida posits that there are multiple meanings for each word. This multiplicity introduces instability into language, something that Jones uses constantly in her works. Multiplicity is a useful tool to unravel the stereotypes created and repeated in fairy tales because it introduces variation into character tropes. Usually, when people of all ages read fairy tales, they do not think of the multiplicity of language, causing many people to treat fairy tale tropes as facts. So, as readers see in Howls Moving Castle, fairy tale tropes are seen as undeniable truths that bar the possibility of other truths, and these undeniable truths are turned into rules, controlling characters and readers alike. Diana Wynne Jones has expressed a dismissal of rules in various speeches and essays, seeing rules as a hindrance to creativity and endless possibilities. Jones is much like Sophie. As a young person, she read many myths and fairy tales and was saddened to find that as an eldest child and a girl, I was barred from heroism entirely. Jones felt trapped by fairy tale tropes because they are treated as universal truths and bar people from certain actions, such as heroism, usually based on gender. In all of her works, Jones both presents and interrogates the power of words and reveals that freedom for characters, and ultimately for us as readers, comes through a healthy skepticism towards authority. Allowing for this skepticism, Jones does not take an autocratic approach to her writing. In Howls Moving Castle, her characters are known to slither out, such as finding a lost prince or admitting one's true feelings. In Ingri, there is a lack of fixedness in the written word, representing the infinite possibilities the universe offers. Everything in Ingri hates being pinned down, characters and setting alike. They all want to experience these possibilities, and Jones does not enforce fairy tale conventions, reforming narrative conventions, and introducing a plethora of options. So her characters were able to use their heterodoxy to easily break away from stereotypes. Even so, change can be scary, and going against perceived universal truth can be daunting. Fear of doing something wrong, such as seeking your fortune. Sophie believes that she is destined for failure because of the fundamental fairy tale convention of the special destiny of the youngest child when there are several children in a family. Since Sophie is the oldest sister of 3, she believes that she should not seek her fortune, so her actions are limited by fairy tale conventions. Sophie is trapped. However, she does not actively seek a way out. For Jones and her characters, it is important, therefore, for those possessing power and authority to moderate their behavior, and for those subject to that power to be vigilant and critical and not follow blindly. Sophie blindly follows fairy tale rules and keeps herself from leaving her house. Once she does leave her house to visit her sister, she is terrified of everything around her. I think Sophie is afraid because she has an intense longing to go on an adventure. And if Sophie subverts her stereotype, she could be punished. Marcia Lieberman comments on this fear, writing, "Good temper and meekness are so regularly associated with beauty, and ill temper with ugliness, that this in itself must influence children's expectations." From fairy tales, Sophie has learned that if she goes against her fate, no matter how unfair it is, she could become ugly and unwanted, something that most people want to avoid. Still, Sophie is unsatisfied with her life as a hat maker and almost leaves her house to seek her fortune, consequences be damned. However, she never gathers the courage to leave, which confuses Sophie. It was very odd. Sophie had always thought that she was nearly as strong-minded as Letty. Now she was finding that there were some things that she could only do when there were no excuses left. Sophie thought that she made her own decisions. However, after a few months of resigning herself to her fate, she realizes that she does not take agency in her life, allowing others to make decisions for her. So Sophie's actions are controlled by her fear of the consequences of going against her stereotype, and that fear prevents her from fighting back. Unknowingly working against your stereotype, failing at being wicked. While Sophie is confined by her fairy tale condition of being the oldest, other characters, such as Howl, think that they can find freedom by changing themselves to fit a stereotype. Howl is a Bluebeard character who was known to amuse himself by collecting young girls and sucking the souls from them, or some people said he ate their hearts. He was an utterly cold-blooded and heartless wizard. Howl, a stranger to Ingri, goes out of his way to adhere to the Bluebeard trope to convince people that he is evil so that he can avoid any confrontation. He even sent his apprentice Michael to Market Shipping, Sophie's hometown, to blacken his name, and the rumors spread quickly. Readers learn that while Howl is not cold-hearted, he is heartless. Howl is a shameless flirt who pursues girls until they fall in love with him. Calcifer, Howl's fire demon, says, "He's only interested until the girl falls in love with him. Then he can't be bothered with her." Howl does not actually eat these girls' hearts, but he does break them mercilessly. Although Howl is a heartbreaker, he still opens his heart to help others in need. Calcifer was a shooting star terrified of death, so Howl gave Calcifer his heart to save his life. Furthermore, Howl took Michael on as an apprentice when Michael was living on his doorstep as a penniless orphan. As a result, Michael does not think Howl is wicked, but Howl must keep up the act, saying, "Yes, I am. You forget just how wicked I'm being at the moment, Michael." Howl's womanizing ways directly contrast to his kindness towards Calcifer, Michael, and even Sophie, showing that Howl is not as wicked as he wants to be. Following the Bluebeard trope does not change his true character, but it does add complexities, especially when readers learn that he follows the trope to avoid the Witch of the Waste curse caused by his Bluebeard tendencies. Make it make sense. Eagerly trying to slither out of finding the lost prince, Howl sends Sophie to blacken his name to the king. However, Sophie finds it hard to tarnish Howl's name because of the complexities of his personality. She states, "Half the time I think he doesn't care what happens to anyone as long as he's all right. But then I find out how awfully kind he's been to someone. Then I think he's kind just when it suits him, only then to find out he undercharges poor people. He's a mess." Sophie's description of Howl shows the intricacies of his character, making it impossible to describe him using fairy tale tropes. Although he is hard to define, Howl's actions do not earn him the freedom he seeks. In Jones's works, her characters must learn to free themselves from coercive power. Howl does not try to free himself from the Bluebeard trope or the Witch of the Waste curse, both coercive powers. Instead, he wants to slither out of them without any confrontation or change. As a result, all of Howl's attempts to be wicked mightily fail, showing that it is impossible to follow your chosen stereotype in a world of endless possibilities. A useless prince. He literally loses his head. In most fairy tales, princes are the doers, and Jones's Prince Justin starts off as a doer since he had gone into exile. Nobody quite knew the reason. Prince Justin follows the conventional path set for fairy tale princes by setting off on an adventure to save someone. However, Prince Justin does not try to rescue a damsel in distress, as princes usually do. He wants to rescue his friend who had disappeared, Wizard Solomon. Having Prince Justin go on a journey to look for Wizard Solomon destabilizes the patriarchal idea and stereotype in fairy tales that only women need saving. Lieberman states, "The sexes of the rescuer and the person in danger are almost as constantly predictable. Men come along to rescue women who are in danger of death or are enslaved, imprisoned, abused, or plunged into an enchanted sleep which resembles death. In Ingrid, men find themselves in situations that only a woman can save them from." So, exemplifying Ingrid women's agency, Sophie finds the prince, although he's not all there. Jones writes, "There was a man sitting in it, a throne, wearing a green uniform and long shiny boots, and he had no head on his shoulders at all." Sophie realized she was looking at all that was left of Prince Justin. Sophie saves Prince Justin, and she is the reason why his body is restored. Without Sophie, Prince Justin would have been headless for the rest of time. However, he does not recognize Sophie's role in his restoration. Even though Sophie is the reason for his rescue, Prince Justin says to Howl, "I believe I must thank you for rescuing me from the witch." Jones understands the power of these tropes, and the idea of a male rescuer is hard to overcome, even in a world of endless possibilities. Prince Justin's gratitude towards Howl implies that he is unwilling or unable to recognize that a woman saved his life due to fairy tale conventions, so what is praiseworthy in males, however, is rejected in females. The heterodoxy in Ingrid allows Prince Justin to follow the prince trope at will, not just subvert gender conceptions, and he does go against some aspects of his trope. At the end of the fairy tale, the prince usually marries the heroine and they live happily ever after. However, Prince Justin does not find love at the end of the novel and gets back to my royal brother. Prince Justin does not return home a hero or marry a princess and live happily ever after. Instead, he goes home to help the king strategize for the war. He shows readers that it is possible to follow some parts of a stereotype and completely ignore others. Even though stereotypes can be constricting, choosing parts of a stereotype taking advantage of many of the infinite possibilities, foster freedom. No meek girls here. Sophie's sisters, Letty and Martha, take their own fate in their hands, which, in a fairy tale world, is unusual because an examination of the best known stories show that active and resourceful girls are in fact rare. They do not let Fanny, Martha's mother, and Letty's and Sophie's stepmother decide their futures. Of course, believing fairy tale tropes, Sophie felt as that Fanny had worked everything out as it should be. Letty, as his second daughter, was never likely to come to much, so Fanny had put her where she might meet a handsome young apprentice and live happily ever after. Martha, who was bound to strike out and make her fortune, would have witchcraft and rich friends to help her. After learning Fanny's plans, Letty laughed in a way that showed she was not pleased at all. Letty could be awkwardly strong-minded at times. Because Martha and Letty are not pleased with Fanny's plans, they switch places. They do not allow fairy tale conventions to force them into a life they do not want. David Rudd believes that inquiry is not just a straightforward reversal of fairy tale stereotypes. Women operate within patriarchy, but are shown to have agency. Throughout the novel, readers think that the female characters are being used, but actually they are secretly asserting their agency. For instance, Howl courts Letty for a considerable amount of time, and Sophie thinks that Letty is in love with him. However, Letty is only nice to Howl in order to find out how he knew about you, Sophie. Letty is not one of Howl's conquests. She only allows herself to be wooed by Howl so that she can fulfill her goal, to find out what happened to Sophie after the transformation. Most submission is a ploy to trick other characters and readers. Women in inquiry show their strength and level-headedness, not fazed by the bizarre, such as a talking scarecrow, making inquiry the perfect world for Sophie to become the powerful storyteller Jones intends for her to be. Sophie, one woman force of chaos. Sophie is the catalyst of change in the novel because she can talk things to life. Her words, no matter how insignificant, are transformed into a performative utterance, defined as speech that does not simply describe something, it makes it happen. For example, when a minister declares, "I now pronounce you man and wife," he is not only describing them, but bringing that condition into being. Performative utterances are particularly powerful in Jones's worlds because many of her characters can perform magic as well, so any utterance can be invested with power if the speaker has magical power, making anything possible. Because Sophie can perform magic, even when she is ignorant of her powers, Sophie is a powerful character who has a profound effect on the people around her. While at the hat shop, Sophie talks to the hats, accidentally charming them, and gives them qualities passed on to their wearers. She accidentally does the same thing with Howl's suit when they first met, not knowing the other's identity. Sophie thinks to herself, he, Howl, was such a dashing specimen too, with a bony, sophisticated face, really quite old, well into his 20s, and elaborate blonde hair. What a courtly person. The reader can tell that Sophie finds Howl attractive, and her thoughts turn into performative utterances, accidentally charm his suit so that other women find him attractive when he wears it. Discussing this scene, Rudd writes, "But though this tells us that she was then unaware of her power to talk things to life and to influence them, it does not change the fact that, even back then, she had some agency, and that her appearance had, from the outset, affected Howl too, in a way he also did not seem conscious of. She has agency, but is afraid to use it until the Witch of the Waste turns her into an old woman, forcing her to leave her home and seek her fortune, which makes her feel more comfortable using her agency." Sophie is a storyteller, but she cannot portray the heterodoxy of inquiry without living in the moving castle, where appearances are misleading. When she told the castle to stop moving, the castle obediently came to a rumbling, grinding halt, giving readers a sense of Sophie's magical powers because the castle moves by magic. Shivering from the cold, Sophie immediately goes toward the fire and the hearth, crying out, "Ah, my fortune." When Sophie talks about finding her fortune, she is never specific of what that fortune is, something that is common in many fairy tales. For most heroines, it seems that living happily ever after is their fortune, so readers can guess that that is what Sophie wants as well. When Sophie calls the fire her fortune, she was referring to the fire's warmth after being out in the cold, but she unknowingly said that storytelling is her fortune. Calcifer, who moves the castle, is the fire in the fireplace. So when Sophie moves towards the fireplace, she also moves into the driving seat of the story, thus relocating the tradition of the fairy tale in its historical context. Calcifer moves more than just a castle. The constantly shifting setting allows for Sophie to change the story because expectations are easily removed. Before she can tell a new story, however, she must scrub away the stereotypes imposed on fairy tales by the patriarchal voice. Sophie lives in the castle as a cleaning lady, and she takes the job seriously. She cleans so much that Calcifer and Michael complain endlessly. When Sophie says that everyone will be happier when the castle is clean, Michael replies, "But I'm miserable now." She's scrubbing away the dirt from fairy tales, aka the patriarchal voice, covering the plaintive cries of German women in the spin's tube. After Sophie whitewashes the castle, Howl asks, "What's happening here? It seems much lighter." Sophie's whitewashing of the castle shows that she is taking an active role in her story. She is cleaning away the controlling stereotypes, tropes, and conventions so that she can create new stories. Sophie does not see her cleaning as the first step in her storytelling fortune because she does not know that she has magical powers. She is expressing her anger on the unjustness of her life and the Witch of the Waste curse. Rudd mentions that Sophie's cleaning is magnified in such alarming, excessive, and potent ways that it accrues sufficient power to evoke fear in all the male members of the household. The male members of the household, specifically Calcifer and Michael, are terrified of Sophie's cleaning, not only because of Sophie's anger and its inconvenience, but also because she is scrubbing away the familiar tropes to write new ones, allowing for the renewal of characters. And Sophie is right. Everyone is much happier once she finishes cleaning. While cleaning the castle, Sophie looks for girls' hearts, moving Howl's spells around and accidentally turns Howl's hair pink. In anger, he yells, "What has that one woman force of chaos done to these spells?" I think this is the best way to describe Sophie because she is a force of chaos. But her chaos is not unnavigable. She unknowingly changes the world around her, and she leaves no prisoners, except for the spiders at Howl's behest. She sees the world as something that can and should be changed, even though many times she thinks she had got it wrong as usual. Sophie is not confident in her powers and is still confined by fairy tale tropes, even as an old woman. She believes that tidying up is what I'm here for. Sophie has caused the chaos by clearing away expectations, but she does not understand that she has to help others navigate the new surroundings as the storyteller. However, when Howl first meets Sophie in the castle, he can see her power and her capabilities as a storyteller. Whenever anything happens, Howl blames Sophie, and he's not entirely wrong. Still, like Sophie, readers cannot always see how Sophie is to blame. For instance, Sophie remakes Howl's ruined suit, but it's too small. So she asks Michael to make an enlargement spell. However, the spell works too well, and Howl's suit continues to grow after the powder is dusted off. Michael tries to take the blame, but Howl replies, "Your fault? Garbage. I can detect Sophie's hand a mile off, and there are several miles of this suit." Even though Michael performed the magic, Sophie still had an effect on the spell, making it stronger. In fact, Calcifer calls the spell strong, the same thing he says when Sophie throws her weed killer in a fit of anger. Because of the strength of the weed killer, readers can see that Sophie strengthened the enlargement spell, so she has a hand in the magic that happens in the castle, even if she does not see herself as the powerful witch she is. As a result, Howl can easily detect Sophie's power, even when she cannot. Howl sees Sophie's strength, recognizing that she never does things by halves. Howl knows Sophie is a storyteller unsure of her powers, but he also understands that Sophie is the one who can help him find the freedom he wants by guiding him to face change head-on. Through Sophie, Howl and the readers can navigate the heterodoxy of inquiry and open themselves to the endless possibility. Howls Moving Castle in 2022. After Sophie becomes her real age again, Hal says to her, "I've been wondering all along if you would turn out to be that lovely girl I met on May Day. Why were you so scared then?" I'm a little disappointed that we don't get Sophie's response, but maybe it would be impossible for Sophie to explain her fear. She thought that she was a strong-minded young woman, but she was actually controlled by her societal expectations. Every time I read Howls Moving Castle, I always notice something different hiding beneath the words. I understand how easy it is to become like Sophie. It's easy to think that you are in control of your future, but sadly, that is not always the case. It's daunting to go out into the world and seek your fortune, whatever that may be, and fail miserably, especially if your livelihood is on the line. I am faced with that fear constantly, and sometimes I feel if I make the wrong decision, I will suffer for the rest of my life. Yes, it is a little dramatic, but because of my gender, my race, and my identity, it's not too terribly far off. But Sophie's journey gives me courage. Even when Sophie is convinced she is a failure, she still has many successes and saves the day. Sophie decides to act, even when she's not sure if she should be doing anything or if she's doing the right thing. I want to be like Sophie. I want to have the courage to do what I want without worrying about the consequences and accept the agency that I have, however limited it is. Even in this post-structuralist world, there are not the endless possibilities that Jones creates in her works. So, I guess I'm going to have to become my own storyteller. Hey y'all, I hope you enjoyed watching the video. If you enjoyed learning about Diana Wynne Jones, Howls Moving Castle, fairy tales, all that other stuff, you can check out her other works. This is the book I talked about today, Howls Moving Castle, which was turned into a movie. But she has a lot of other novels. They're all really entertaining and fun, and a lot of them do center on like magic and telling your own fate and all this other stuff. So really interesting, and definitely recommend that y'all check them out. If you enjoyed watching this video, please like and subscribe so that you will see my videos every single week, and I will see y'all in the next one. Bye!